Hello everyone, welcome to another one of my React project videos. In this video, we'll build the game Wordle. So if you are not familiar with Wordle, you can go on the website. I've linked it in the description. But basically, there's a word that you have to guess and you can type in your guesses. So for example, in this case, let's say our guess is brand. It's 5-letter words and you get 6 guesses. And obviously you can backspace, and every time you make a guess, it'll give you some colors. So this gray color means that this letter is not in the word. These yellow colors mean that the letter is in the word, but they're not in the right position. So there is a B and an A in the word. These are not the right positions for these letters. And so I'll go ahead and make another guess here. So let's say fable. Okay, so now it says A and B are in the right position, but F, L, E are just not in the word. So we'll keep guessing. So let's say I just do like table again, even though L, E is not in the word. But so it says there's a T in the word, but it's not at the start because it's yellow, right? So maybe I'll go ahead and guess like, let's say habit. Okay, so this is the correct word and says game completed habit. So this is game over. I can't press anything. And so I can reset it, try again. So let's say I just do a bunch of R's, random letters. So let's say you guessed everything and you didn't guess the word. It'll just say game over and tell you the correct answer. And then in the middle, if you just guess some things, enter, then you can also just like reset the game. It'll just reset it to the start. Okay, so to start, I've just created a simple React app and cleaned up some of the stuff. If you want to know more detailed steps on that, you can check out my first React project video. In the first few seconds, I show you how to do that. So over here, we'll just start by updating our index.html with the app title, tag Wordle. And in the header, which is similar to what we created in that previous video, I'll just add tag Wordle as the header title, and over here is our app.js. And in the previous video I used darkly, but here I want to use slate, so I'll just change that to the slate theme. Here's our basic template Wordle app, which is what we'll start building off. And so initially we'll just have our Wordle main component, which will be over here, and within that main component we'll create 2 sub components, one for the game board that you saw earlier, which is basically the 6 rows of words, and one is for the keyboard, right? So let me go ahead and create those components. So here we have a simple Wordle main component which I created, and then in our app.js all we need to do is kind of include that component as the container. So I'll put it in over here as the Wordle main component. So now it'll just render whatever is in here, right? So if you put like hello world, you can see it renders here as the container. So we have that set up. Now within the Wordle main component, we'll also have 2 subcomponents. One is the game board, which we'll create in a bit, and the other one is the keyboard, right? So those will be kind of 2 high-level components that we add over here, and then we'll just fill this out as we go. So these components don't exist, so I'll go ahead and create them. Okay, so I've created game board and keyboard, and over here now we just have to import them and make sure they're accessible. So over here, again, we just expect to see nothing, so that's fine. Let's move forward here a bit. So now the Wordle main component will basically be like handling the game state, so to say. So the game state will tell us like what's the state of the game, what words are guessed, what words are still not guessed, what words are in the right position, and so on. And these 2 will just render it. So we'll have over here a GameState object, right? And we'll just use state. And what the GameState will contain is we'll create a GameState manager over here. So let's create a folder here for the game logic. So this game logic will host all of the brains and the logic of the game. So in this folder, I'm going to go ahead and create like a GameState manager, which will basically manage our game state and run all the logic. So over here, we'll go ahead and create a function called, get initial game state, which will basically return an object containing the initial game state, right? And this game state manager is what we'll call to kind of host the functions for all the game logic. So in general, you want to make your components dumb and just be rendering things and have separate out your logic, right? So over here, we're just going to go ahead and call initial game state as the initial game state. And obviously we need to import useState, so let's import that from React. So now we have this initial game state set up, and we need to be able to know what to render in these two things, right? So in the game board, we'll just render like all the rows, right? So there's six rows, right? And each row has a cell, right? So 6 rows and 5 columns, right? Because each column is a word. And so like we have the cells right now. What will the properties of the cell be so that we can render the game board? That's how we should think about this, right? So initially we'll have, I'll call them our rows, right? So rows, we'll basically make it a 2D array. So we'll have an array that's like 6 rows and 5 columns. So I'm just going to have constant for the number of rows and number of columns, just so it's clear. So I'm just going to say here arrays num rows dot fill, or sorry, it's array num row dot fill. So this will create an array of num rows elements with each element equaling to this value over here, right? And for each row, what we want to do is we want to fill in the column, right? And for the column, I'll just put initial cell state. So what this initial cell state look like, we'll have a function over here that's initial cell state. And so inside the cell, what do we have, right? So we have a letter, right? So the letter will be null. And then we'll have basically the state of the cell, which will tell us, is it enabled, is it disabled, is it yellow, is it green, like how to render the cell, right? So I'll create some kind of constants here to give us a bounded set of cell states. Basically, we want to make this like an enum, right? So we'll have const cell state, and I'll create a default cell state over here. For the purposes of our rendering for the game board, we just need a button class name, right? So the button class name, I'll just give it btn primary. So this will be basically the class name of the button when we initially initialize it, and then we'll have other states as well. So for example, if I put in the incorrect letter, I'll make the button class name secondary, which will make it a bit like grayed out. And then if I have the correct letter, I'll make it button warning, which will make it like yellow. And then if I have the correct position, which is correct letter and correct position, then it's button success, which will make it green, right? So this will be enough for our rows. And so initially the state, I'll just put it as cell state.default. So this will be the initial cell state, and the letter will be null. So obviously in our initial game state, we'll have rows. And over here, I need to put actually array num calls, right? So I'll have array with num rows. Each element of that will be an array where of num calls, which is an array of 5 elements, and each element will just have the initial cell state, right? So we'll have this as our initial game state. Now, if we go back to our Wordle main component, the game board just needs the rows, right? So we'll just say rows equals game state dot rows, right? And one best practice over here is like the game state should just be one object, right? So you should not have like rows and everything as separate state variables over here, because you want to make sure that when you update the game state, it's updated atomically so that the whole UI refreshes consistently, right? So let's say if you update rows and GameOver and some other attributes together, you want to avoid race conditions where like one is updated but the other is not, and that creates like weird UI states, right? So if all of these attributes go together and you're updating multiple elements in this data every time an action is taken, then it's better to keep it as a single game state object rather than modeling each of these as separate state variables. Anyway, right now we just have rows, but we'll add more later on. So yeah, so the game board, we pass in the rows. So if I come to game board, I'll just model this rows parameter. So we'll just take in the rows over here, and over here we'll just go ahead and loop through each row. So we'll just do rows.map. We'll take in the single row and the row index, and then we'll go ahead and create a div for the row. So this will be our row div, where we'll have row underscore row index as the key. This is just something React needs when you're looping through an array. And then a class name, this is just bootstrap stuff. So call 12 center. And then we need to loop through our cells. So within the row, there's multiple cells. So I'll go ahead and create a for each loop for that. So we have this over here for the row. We are going to loop through the cell, and there's going to be a call index for that. And then over here, we're going to go ahead and render a button for our cells, but we have 2px margin, courier new font, just so that it's monospace and each one is spaced out evenly. And then the same thing, we'll have a key. So I just concatenated row and column to create a unique key for each cell. And disabled is true just because, we don't want them to click these. These are just going to be driven by the keyboard. And then I just created a button with the button class name, remember, from the cell states over here, that we just render. So whatever the state of the cell is in the row, it'll just render it, right? And then in the contents of the cell, we have, if there's a letter, we'll render that. Otherwise, we'll just put underscore, right? So this should take care of rendering our game board. Now, there's still an error over here that says rows is undefined. I think over here we made a mistake. So it's just, this one is supposed to be game state, set game state, because that's what the use state returns. And so now, okay, over here you can see we rendered all of our rows. And if in the game state we go ahead and change our initial state to, let's say, like 5, we should see this change if we refresh the page, right? And let's say if you change our default, instead of default, let's just say we say correct letter, we should see all of these turn to green, or sorry, to yellow, because it's just the correct letter. And if it's the correct position, we should see all of these turn to green because they're all green, right? So we'll change it back to default over here and just put null as our initial state, which will just have it like this. So you can see how playing around with the state changes the render. And that's because, we just made this game board a dumb render component that just renders based on the rows. So now that's our game board. Now this looks a bit bland, so let's create our app title. So to do that, I'll just create over here an H1. These are from the boot swatch theme that I picked, and new line. So you'll just see over here, it just writes this out and creates an underline. And then we'll also create our help and reset buttons that we had earlier. So I'll just go ahead and create a new row over here for those buttons. And then I created a column with the text center. So we'll have our buttons centered. And this is, again, all Bootstrap or Boot Swatch. Don't worry about it if you don't know the framework. You can use a UI framework of your choice, or you can go to the Bootstrap website and learn about it a bit. But I just find Bootstrap a bit intuitive because it has easy access to rows and columns. But we'll go ahead and create over here our first button, which will be basically the help button, right? So we just create a button info, which will make it blue. And I just linked to a page on WikiHow on how to play Wordle. So if you click this page, it'll take you to WikiHow, a step-by-step guide on how to play Wordle. So I found that that's just very easy to do. And then we'll also create our reset button. So for our reset button, we'll have an action that basically resets the game state to the initial state, right? So reset means that whatever game state we're at, we'll go ahead and reset it to the initial state. And so let's add our button over here that calls that function. So we'll have a little space in between, and then we'll just say on click equals reset. So it'll call this function and say reset, right? So this will just reset whatever we have to our initial game state. Now, the last thing we have to render is the keyboard. So the keyboard has various keys. Let's first analyze, okay, how will we change our game state to kind of have those fields so we can just pass that in and render it the keyboard. So the keyboard needs two pieces of information. One is if it's game over or not, right? Because if it's game over, it shouldn't allow you to click any of the keys anymore. So we need a game over state, right? So initially we'll have this as false because, obviously when you start, the game isn't over. And then similar to how we have rows, we'll also need the state of the letters, right? So as you noticed in the initial demo, as we were clicking things and identifying what is in the correct position, correct letter, we also updated the keyboard, right? So for the letters, we will just have a cell state similar to this, right? And then we need a state for each letter. So there are 26 letters in the alphabet, right? A to Z. So we'll just say 26, right? And for each of the letters, we'll put in a state, right? So we'll say like, okay, is it an incorrect letter? Is it a correct letter? Is it correct position? And so on. So we'll just say over here, cell state.default again. So we'll just use the default, but we want to have a separate, a keyboard class name from the button class name, just in case we want the keyboard to look different. So since in this case, I wanted my keyboard to look white, I'll just put the keyboard class name as button light. And for the other ones, I'll just copy the whatever button class name we have for the keyboard class name as well. Okay, so there we have our letters and our game over. Now let's go ahead, once we have this in our game state, let's go ahead and update our rendering for the keyboard to account for those. And obviously we'll have to take those in over here. So we'll take in game over and letters. So to start here, we want to have like a nice like QWERTY keyboard similar to how we have our actual keyboard. So I just created this key arrangement array which will like tell us what keys to render. So we'll just go ahead and create a simple loop on this array. So I've created a similar loop over here where we go through the key arrangement instead of the rows. And for each key arrangement row, we do the same thing. We assign a unique key, and then we go through the columns. And then for each column again, so I'll go ahead and type in the basic button over here. So we have, just a basic style of 2px. We have a key of cell, row, and column just to create a unique key. And then a class name of btn light just to make it white. And we'll replace this in a second with the actual class name from the letter state. And then disabled equals game over. So if it's game over, we don't want to be able to click the button. And then on click, we'll need some kind of letter callback, right? So we'll just pass in a letter callback saying, okay, this letter was clicked, and we'll pass in letter, right? So over here, we also need a letter callback to say, okay, if someone clicks this letter, here's the function that we need to call. So now if we go back to our Wordle main component, we need to actually pass in those things in the keyboard. So we'll have game over equals GameState.GameOver, and then we'll have letters equals GameState.letters, and then we'll have over here a letter callback. So we'll say, okay, if we're given a letter, then we'll do something, but for now we'll just keep it as empty. And then we'll go ahead and pass in that letter callback over here. So that's just something that we'll fill in later on. So upon refreshing, you can see over here the keyboards. I'll just insert a break over here so that there's some space between the two. Okay, so you can see all of our keys are white, but now these are just hard-coded to button light, and we want this button color to change based on what we set up over here in the game state, right? So let me go ahead and do that real quick. So basically we need to find the letters at the letter index that we have, right? So in the game state manager, I'll export like a utility function which says basically get index of letter, and we'll pass in the letter. And over here what we'll do is we'll just return how far the letter is from A, right? So we'll just say letter.carcode 0. That means this will just get the first index of the string, and then we'll minus it with the capital A car code. We know all of our letters are all caps, right? So this is how you subtract the character codes or ASCII codes of the letter and A. And so whatever the A will be basically 0, B will be 1, and so on. So this will get like how far it is from A. So over here in our keyboard, what we can simply do, instead of just hard coding button.light, what we'll do is we'll say, okay, letters at, and then the index will be basically get index of letter, and we'll pass in our letter, right, which is the current letter that we are working on, and then we'll just say keyboard class name. So with this, it should become white. Now over here, you can see if I go to my game state manager and we change this to, let's say, correct position, we should see our letters change to green, right? If I say incorrect letter, we should see our letters change to like gray, right? And then if I change game over to true, we should see that these are all disabled, right? So that means now whatever we're putting in the game state is basically reflecting into our keyboard. If you remember from our demo, when the game was over, we actually displayed the word that was chosen. We said game over, and then the correct word is the word that we were actually guessing, right? So we, in our game state, we also need to have an indication of our chosen word, right? So when every time we reset, we should get a new chosen word. I'll go ahead and create a new file over here, which will be our word repository, right? So this will be all of the words that we will have. Over here, I just got this list of 5-letter words online, and here I created a function get random word, which will basically get a random word from this array, right? So, and it'll make it to uppercase, right? Because all of our keyboards and everything are uppercase. So for simplicity, we just make it uppercase. And so back to the game state manager, our chosen word, we can just say like get random word, right? So over here, when we display our game board, we can have another part over here that says if we're game over, then in that case, we should display game completed word is game state dot chosen word, right? So whatever the chosen word in the game state, if it's game over, we'll just display that word, right? Because the game is over and we cannot do anything anymore. So just to test this out, if you come to the game state manager and change game over to true and refresh this page, you'll see over here game completed word is Azure. Every time you refresh it, you'll see a new word. So basically, we're choosing new words every time over here. So now one last thing we want to do for just to complete our rendering aspect in the keyboard. Remember, we also had enter and backspace over here. So we'll just go ahead and create those keys in our keyboard. So after we render our keys, we can now go ahead and render our enter and backspace. So I'll go ahead and create first just a div for them to hold the two buttons. So once we have this div, now we'll go ahead and create the two buttons inside them. So I'll have enter and backspace, and I'll just make them BTN light. I'll just make them white, and disabled is game over. So obviously for game over, we can't click them. And on click, I'll pass in an enter callback and a backspace callback. So like every time you hit enter, what should be the action? Every time you hit backspace, what should be the action? So again, this is React, just dumb render components. So we'll put over here enter callback and backspace callback, which will basically pass in the functions or callback, right? So this should kind of conclude our keyboard. You can see over here that we have our keyboard. And actually, the keys are still disabled. So if I go back to the game state manager, I should set my game over to false. So this just goes back to the default view. That's good. And now in the Wordle main component, we just need to make sure we pass in our other callbacks. So we have game over letters, and then we have letter callback, which is when you click a letter, enter callback, I'll just put enter callback, and backspace callback, I'll just put backspace callback as well. And with that out of the way, over here, we just need to create those two callbacks just so it doesn't fail. Okay, and so that basically concludes our rendering. So we have all of the pieces over here, and based on the state, this rendering changes. So now all we need to do is implement these callbacks, right? So what happens when you click the buttons and change the state accordingly, so that anytime you do an action, you change the state, these will automatically re-render, right? So basically we worked on the rendering first based on the state, And then now we're going to fill in the logic. So we know that every time we do one of these things, we need to change the state. So what we'll do is we'll create these functions in our game state manager that will handle these clicks, right? So every time it handles the click, it'll give us a new game state. So what we'll do is we'll go to our game state manager, and we already have our initial game state, but we'll go ahead and create like 3 other functions, which is basically export. So we'll say game state after letter pressed, which is it'll take in the existing game state and the letter, and it will return a new game state after this letter is pressed, right? So we'll do similar functions for enter and backspace. So now we have these functions. I'll just go ahead and return game state for now until we fill them out. So if we go over here, let's just complete this. So on letter callback, what we'll do is we'll set game state to game state after letter pressed letter, right? So we'll get the game state after the letter is pressed and set that to the new game state. And we'll do similar things for enter and backspace. So over here, you can see on enter, we set game state to game state after, this should be enter pressed. And on backspace, we set game state to game state after backspace pressed. So that's basically now our Wordle main component, where all we do is we initialize our game state. We use that to render our keyboard, game board, and this little message for game over. And we have these 4 actions. So if we reset, we set game state to initial game state. If we have a letter callback, we set game state to game state after letter. If we have an enter callback, we set game state to game state after enter, and so on. And now basically what this allows us to do is do all our logic in the game state manager and just fill out these functions, and our game should just work because we're just rendering based on the game state, right? So let me go ahead and close everything else, and we're just purely going to focus on this logic over here. So now to implement the game logic, one of the key things we need to know is what row and what column we are on, right? Because when I type a letter, for example, I need to know, sorry, I think I have these parameters swapped. Let me just fix that. Yeah, and I have to pass the game state here actually. So yeah, so every time I press a letter, I need to know what row and what column we're currently on so that we can put the letter on that row or column, right? So over here, we'll need 2 other variables, which is basically the current row that we're on, that the user is on, and the current column that the user is on. So both of these are initialized to 0, okay? So basically the first time the user is going to be on 0, 0, right? Now, on letter pressed, let's put our logic over here. Let's check our boundary conditions, right? So if we're already game over, so let's say if the game is already over, or our current column, let's say we're already like past this and we didn't hit enter yet. So if our game state dot current column is equal to num calls, because after the user finishes this like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the current column is just going to be like at the end, which is going to be equal to num calls. So if we're at the end or we're game over and the user tries to hit enter, then we just return game state, right? Because in this case, nothing changes. So once we do that, we need to update the letter on the cell to match what we typed, right? So over here at the end, we're going to return a new game state. So what I'm going to do is use the spread operator. So this will copy the existing game state, right? And then we'll have rows, which will be our new rows. And in general, we have to create copies. Like in order for React to know that something changed, you have to create copies of the state. So we'll have rows as our new rows, and then we'll have current call to be equal to game state dot current call plus 1. So every time we successfully input a letter, we'll move the column to the next column, but we won't change the row yet because the row only changes when you press enter, right? So we'll just change the column. And obviously, if you're already at the last column, then we just don't do anything, right? Because we're just waiting for the user to hit enter. So now, what is new rows, right? So we need to create our new rows. So to do this, I'll just create a copy initially of rows, right? So we'll just create a copy of the game state rows. And the way I suggest creating deep copies is just to stringify the existing rows and then parse it back to a JSON. So this will create like a deep copy of the rows, copying all the attributes. And now let's go ahead and modify this one. So the reason I don't want to modify the existing rows is because that can affect the game state in weird ways, right? So instead of modifying GameState.rows, I want to create a new object completely, modify that, and then put that into a new object atomically, right? So this will make sure that we're following React best practices. So anyway, we need to change the state of the row that we're in. So this is the initial cell state where the letter is null and the state is default, right? So we're going to go ahead and change that. So we'll say new row at GameState.currentRow and then GameState.currentCall, because that's the row and column we're trying to change, is equal to, and then we're just going to go ahead and copy the existing objects, right? So we're not changing the state, right? So if we add anything else here, we're not changing anything else. All we're doing is changing the letter, right? So we just need to change the letter, and we'll set the letter to whatever letter was passed in, right? If I type something over here, you can see that we're typing, and as soon as we hit the end, we can't type anything anymore, right? And backspace obviously doesn't work, enter doesn't work, so we're just frozen. So now we have this function that handles letters pressed, right? Now let's handle backspace press, so we can actually start backspacing this. So on backspace, we'll have a similar check over here. So if we're already game over, or we're at the first column, right? So if we're at the first column, there's nothing to backspace, right? So we just return the game state. We don't do anything. Then we do a similar thing where we copy the rows, right? So we'll create a copy of the rows, and then we'll modify the rows back to the initial cell state, right? So we'll say new rows at current row, current column -1 equals initial cell state. So why do we do current column -1? Because every time we type a letter, our current column is already at the next one. So to backspace, what we need to do is reset the current column -1 to the initial cell state, right? And then we just return the updated game state, right? So we say over here, return game state rows equals new rows, and current column should be current column -1. So we basically put the pointer back to the previous one. So with this, if I refresh this, let's say if I type DFG and then I do backspace, you can see the letters kind of, erase themselves. And obviously if it's at 0 and we just do backspace, we won't do anything because, we just return the game state as is. So now we can keep typing stuff and doing backspace. So that works. And I see a couple of warnings here, so I'll just change these to equal, equal, equal. Okay, so now the last thing we need to do is our enter pressed logic, right? So over here, again, we'll do the same initial guard clause check, right? Saying if our game state is game over, because on game over, we don't want to react to any keys, or our current column is not equal to numcall. So basically, we won't allow you to press enter unless you're at the end, right? So unless you are, okay, I need to return game state just so this works. So basically we won't allow you to hit enter unless you're at the end, because you can't enter in the middle of a word, right? So this basically says, okay, if the current column is not numcall, so meaning if you're not at the end, then, we can't process an enter, right? So we have to be at the end to be able to process an enter. So this is the initial logic. And then at the end, let's go ahead and return an updated game state. And enter, usually we're going to return a lot of things. So I'm just going to type all of the state variables here, and we'll go them one by one to see what we need to change. So we'll spread the initial game state, right? When you hit enter, we won't reset the chosen word because the word should stay the same, right? So we'll erase that because that should be copied from the game state. For rows, we'll construct new rows like we did for the other cases. So we'll just put new rows over here because, every time we hit enter, we do need to update the colors of that row that we entered, right? Because we need to tell the user, okay, is it correct position, wrong position, whatever. We need to update the colors. So we need new rows. We also need new letters, right? Because when we hit enter, we also need to update the state of the keyboard, right? Because when you hit enter and then you reveal the colors of the row, you also need to update the same colors on the keyboard, just so to give the user an idea. And then current column will reset to 0, right? So once you're at the end, you hit enter, your column goes back to 0, but your row now increments to 1. So we'll say GameState dot current row plus 1, right? So basically whatever the previous row was and then they hit enter, we increment the row to row plus 1. And obviously if they hit the last row, it's going to be game over. So they won't be allowed to hit enter again. So we'll just do row plus 1. This won't go like way beyond, right? So this will just end at num rows at some point. So now game over is a function of two things. So either if they already guessed the word, that means they're already done guessing the word correctly, we'll create a boolean called all correct, which means like, did they guess everything correctly? So the game is over if everything is guessed correctly, or if we're already at the end. So if they finished all their guesses for all of the 6 rows, then we're game over. So basically if the current row which they entered on is equal to num rows minus 1, that means this is already the last row that they entered on, and so then it's game over. Regardless if they're correct or not, then it's game over, right? So if either they're all correct already or this is the last row, that's what we'll set game over to. So once they're game over, they can't do anything else, and we'll just display whatever the state, and we'll display the word that they were supposed to guess. So that will be the logic for game over. Now over here, there's a few things we need to compute. So we have our new rows, which will initialize to this, and then we'll have our new letters, right? So we'll say new letters, which will initialize to be GameState.letters. And then we'll have a variable for all correct equals true, right? So what we'll do is we'll basically loop through all of the letters that they have guessed in this row which they're pressing enter on, right? So we'll just go ahead and loop from I equals 0 to numCalls, and we'll go ahead and update. In each loop, we're going to update all correct, and we're also going to update the different cells in that row, right? So we'll go ahead and capture the current row array, which is basically all of the cells in the current row. So this is the row that they pressed enter on, and we'll go ahead and update this array with the new state. And this array, since it's already referenced from new rows, the new rows will automatically get updated as we update this array, and that will go over here. Inside our loop, what do we need to do to kind of set the correct state, right? So first, let's figure out if their guess for this column. So we're now going through the column, right? So let's say this is our guess. So we'll evaluate each letter, right? So now the first thing we need to do is, does this letter match the first letter of our chosen word? If it matches, then that's basically a success state, right? So let's say if GameState chosen word car at I is equal to the letter of the current row. So this is the current row, and the letter of that row, which is basically the state of the cell, the letter of that is that equal to the same position of the game state. If it is, we'll set the current row array to the correct position, right? So the state over here, it's initialized with defaults. We'll change it to correct position because that they guessed it correctly, right? So now otherwise, if it's not in the correct position, let's try to evaluate, okay, is it at least the correct letter? Like, is it in the word, but just in the wrong position, right? So to do that, what we'll check is, okay, if GameState.chosenWord index of the letter, so index of the current letter that we're evaluating is not -1. That means it is present in the word. So in this case, we'll set our current row I cell state to correct letter. That means it's not in the correct position, but it's in the correct letter. But at this point, all correct is already false, right? So at this point, we initialized our all correct to true, remember? But over here, this means that they are correct. But if this first condition is false, that means not all the letters are correct. So that means all correct should be false in any branch outside this first branch. And then finally, if they're not in the correct position and it's not even in the chosen word, then what we'll do is we'll say that, okay, we'll set the cell state to incorrect letter, which is basically saying, okay, this letter is just not in the word at all. It's just incorrect letter, right? So that's going to be for the cell state of the board. How about for our letters, right? So we set it for our rows, but how about for our letters? Now for our letters, note that it's a bit interesting because let's say your word was like hello, and in the first time I guessed hell I, right? So that means I got green on these 4, and then this is just gray, right? But then in the next try, let's say for some stupid reason, I guess like I-I-I-H, right? So in this case, like H was already in the correct position before, but now I've like for some dumb reason put it in the wrong position. So we should retain the best guess that they had so far for the letter, right? So when we look at letter states, we need to consider, okay, what is the current state of the letter, and is the new state of the letter better than the previous state? So like in this case, the state of, like if hello, so this is our chosen word. In this case, the H will have a state of correct letter, right? But in this case, H will become correct position instead of correct letter, right? So now we want to make sure we retain the best possible outcome they've had so far for that letter. We don't want to just take the current outcome. And so to do that, what I'll do is in the cell states, I'll add a value, and the value basically means the precedence, right? So default is 0. So by default, I can override 0. Incorrect letter is 1, right? So that means if I go from no information about this letter to some information, that's always better. So incorrect letter is 1. And then if they get the correct letter but wrong position, I'll set that as 2. So correct letter can override incorrect letter, but not vice versa. And then finally, if they get the correct position, then the value is 3, right? Because this is basically the highest possible thing for the keyboard. So once I recognize a letter as green, I leave it green. I don't override it with anything else. And so over here, what we're going to do is once we've determined the state of the current row for the board, all we're going to do is check if now the current row state value is greater than what already exists for the letter, right? So what I'm going to do is if current row I state value is the variable we just added, if that's greater than what already exists for new letters value, and the index of the letter, remember new letters is an array of 26, and we just get the index of the letter based on the letter of that cell. So if that value is greater than what we already have for this letter, in that case, we'll go ahead and replace it with what we have from the board. New letters for the index of the letter of the current row. So new letters at that index is equal to the current row array state that we already determined over here, right? And so based on that, we set our game state. So this should actually be all. Like this should make this game work. So now if we refresh it, let's try to play it and guess the word. So let's say we start with like hello, right? Now I can backspace, I can type again, and if I hit enter, we see over here, okay, H, these are all in the incorrect letters, so they're not in the word at all. We see E, it's in the word, but not at this position. So let's keep trying to guess it. So let's say our next guess is maybe games. So at this point, I didn't use any of these letters, but I used the E in another position. So if I say enter, okay, so it says none of these letters are in the word, but E is again correct. It's in the word, but it's just not in these two positions. So we know that E is either the first, third, or last letter, right? So now let me think of another guess. Let's say I try freed, right? So I say freed. And this is definitely wrong because E is not in this position, but let's just try it. Okay, so now we have some more information. We have E is in the correct position here in the middle, but R is in the word, but not in the correct position. So let's keep going with our guesses based on this updated information. So I'll just make a dumb guess over here. I'll just say stern. So we'll put E in the right position. I'll put R over here and I'll see what happens. Okay, so we have E and R in the correct position, but none of these are in the word. I'll just try again where. This is dumb because I know there's no H, but let's just see what happens. No new information. At this point, I'll just give up and just do anything. So we can see that, when we type something wrong, it still preserved these E and R. So the correct one is query. So Query, and we didn't use Q, U, and Y. So you can see that they're still white. So yeah, this is basically the Wordle game. Now, let me suggest few enhancements you can make to this on your own. I'll obviously put all the code in the repository. The link is in the description. So few enhancements you can make to this is first that, right now you have to use your mouse to type on the keyboard. It would be nice if, you can integrate the actual keyboard so that as you use the keyboard, the words appear over here, and similarly for enter and backspace. So that's one challenge. The other thing is in actual Wordle, if I just type a random word that's not actually a word, then it will not allow me to guess it when I press enter. So your guesses have to be actual words, but in this case, we're just allowing any word to be entered. So that's something you can consider changing. But then to do that, you need to have a comprehensive set of words, right? So another part of this is expanding. Right now, we just have this word repository with fixed words that I pulled out of somewhere, but maybe integrating with some API or expanding this word set, because if you don't have an actual complete word set, you might not be able to put in that validation that I mentioned. So yeah. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something about how to create games and to build Wordle in React. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.